Get your hands where I can see them. Now. The words hit like a slap. Loud. Sharp. Final. She froze, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might rip through her chest. The fluorescent lights of the precinct's interrogation room flickered overhead, humming softly, a cruel contrast to the roar in her ears. Don't make me say it again. Her hands rose slowly. She could taste copper in her mouth from biting her lip too hard. The man towering over her was wearing a badge, but his eyes burned with something far more dangerous than authority. Hatred. I asked you a question. His voice cracked like a whip. What are you doing in this building? Who let you in here? She swallowed hard, holding his gaze but feeling the heat of humiliation crawl up her neck. I don't need permission to be here, she said, her voice steady but barely above a whisper. His laugh was sharp, cutting through the air like glass shattering on concrete. Oh, is that so? You walk into a police station like you own the place. Wearing that suit. What is it, some charity event? Or maybe you're here to clean up after we're done for the night. She flinched, but didn't break eye contact. Step back, she said, this time louder. But he didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer. Close enough that she could smell the coffee and cigarette smoke on his breath. You don't tell me what to do, he hissed. Not here. Her pulse raced. She wanted to scream, but she knew how this looked, how it always looked. A black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. She saw it in his eyes before he even moved. The punch came fast. Too fast to dodge. Her head snapped to the side, pain exploding across her jaw. The taste of blood filled her mouth as she stumbled, barely catching herself against the cold, metal table. The room spun, but she didn't fall. She wouldn't fall. Didn't think I'd hit you, did you? His voice dripped with venom. Her fingers dug into the edge of the table, knuckles white, but she stayed silent. What's wrong? No smart comments now. He laughed again, louder this time, as though the sound alone could break her down further. Her breathing slowed. The sharp pain in her jaw faded into the background as something colder, sharper, settled into her chest. She straightened slowly, wiping the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Her words were low and calm, almost too calm for the way the room crackled with tension. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Excuse me. She stepped toward him, and for the first time, his smirk faltered. I said, she repeated, her voice steady now, you just threw a punch at the wrong person. The room seemed to shrink. The hum of the lights grew louder. Who do you think you are? His voice wavered just enough for her to catch it. But she didn't answer. Not yet. She let the silence hang in the air, let the weight of it press down on him the way his words and fists had tried to press her down. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the door swung open before he could. The man who entered barely glanced at him before locking eyes with her. Ma'am, is everything all right? And just like that, the air shifted. The color drained from the officer's face. His smirk vanished completely, replaced by confusion first, then panic. Ma'am, he repeated, his voice suddenly unsure. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Instead, she turned to face the other man in the room, the one who had just walked in, and spoke with a calm authority that could cut through steel. Tell the director I'll be handling this personally. The officer froze. His hand twitched near his belt, but it was too late for him to reach for anything now. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You don't even know who I am, do you? His lips parted, but no words came out. She leaned in just enough for him to feel the weight of her next words. Don't worry. You'll find out soon enough. The silence that followed was deafening. And in that moment, the tables turned. But the question still hung in the air, sharp and unspoken, who was she? And what was she about to do next? At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and any form of discrimination. This story is a reflection of the challenges many people face, and we believe in using storytelling to highlight injustice and inspire change. To every Black viewer watching, your voice matters, your strength is powerful, and your story deserves to be heard. Thank you for trusting us with your time. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if this story moves you. Let's dive in. The sharp, deliberate click of heels against the cold tile floor echoed through the dimly lit hallway of the precinct. Each step rang out with purpose, cutting through the low hum of fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Special Agent Maya Brooks walked with measured control, her posture straight, her chin high, and her sharp black blazer crisp and flawless. Her shoulders squared, and her eyes focused straight ahead, scanning every detail of the space she entered without hesitation. She knew the weight of the badge tucked discreetly inside her pocket, and she knew exactly what it meant to carry it. But here, in this room, none of it mattered. The air was heavy, thick with tension, coffee, sweat, and something far less tangible but far more dangerous, suspicion. Maya felt it the moment she stepped inside. The silence that followed her entrance wasn't just curiosity, it was judgment. It was the same kind of silence she had felt so many times before in spaces where people like her weren't expected, let alone welcomed. She didn't pause. She didn't slow down. She had spent too many years learning how to move through spaces like this, learning how to wear authority like armor, to mask the fire burning just beneath her skin. Years of hard work, sleepless nights, and battles fought in courtrooms and back offices had built her into the woman she was. But no amount of training could completely drown out the sharp prickle of resentment that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Her eyes swept across the precinct. The harsh lights overhead illuminated the scuffed linoleum floors, faded posters peeling from the walls, and desks cluttered with half-eaten sandwiches and piles of paperwork. Phones rang sporadically, voices murmured in the distance, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. It was exactly the kind of place she had expected, chaotic, hardened, and worn down by the grind of too many shifts and too few victories. But tonight wasn't about the chaos. Tonight was about precision. Maya had come for a reason, a case tied to internal corruption that had landed right on her desk. The evidence pointed here, to this precinct, to one specific officer. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet review of records, no fanfare, no attention, no need to pull rank. She had been careful, deliberate, even cautious. But none of that mattered the moment he saw her. Officer Daniel Reed. He spotted her before she even reached the front desk, his eyes narrowing as if he'd already decided who she was and what she wanted. He had the look of a man who thrived on control, a square jaw, close-cropped hair, and the kind of build that took up space and made sure you knew it. His uniform was tight, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but it was his posture that stood out the most. He didn't just stand, he loomed. "Hey!" His voice cut through the low hum of the room. "You can't be back here." Maya didn't break stride, but she turned her head slightly, locking eyes with him just long enough to make it clear she wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with his type before, loud, brash, and always ready to pull rank. "I have clearance," she said without slowing down, her voice calm but firm. Reed's boots thudded against the tile as he stepped into her path, blocking her way completely. "Clearance for what?" he demanded, folding his arms across his chest. "This is a restricted area." Maya stopped, her heart steady but her jaw tightening. She reached into the folder tucked under her arm, preparing to hand him the paperwork. "I'm here on official business." Reed's laugh was sharp and quick, like nails on glass. "Official business?" His eyes dropped to her suit, scanning her up and down as if she was nothing more than an interruption to his night. "Is that what you're calling it?" Maya didn't move. "Who gave you permission to be here?" he pressed, stepping closer. "I don't need permission," she said, her voice even but carrying an edge that could cut through steel. Reed's smirk twisted into something darker, something heavier. You think you're tough? He asked, his voice dropping low. Think you can just walk in here and start giving orders? Maya didn't flinch. I suggest you step aside, she said, this time sharper, her words slicing through the air. But Reed didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, close enough for her to smell the bitter scent of coffee and cigarettes lingering on his breath. You don't tell me what to do, he said, his voice tight with anger. Before Maya could respond, he moved. It happened too fast for her to stop it. His fist came down hard, hard enough to knock her back a step, hard enough to split her lip. Pain exploded through her jaw, sharp and electric, but she didn't fall. The room spun for half a second, and then it stopped. Reed stepped back, his face twisted into a smirk. Didn't think I'd do it, did you? He said, his voice thick with satisfaction. Maya tasted blood, but she stayed upright. She straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on his. Reed's smirk faltered. Excuse me. Maya stepped closer, her heartbeat slowing as clarity set in. You don't even know who I am, do you? She asked, her voice low but sharp. Reed's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, the door behind them swung open. Ma'am, is everything all right? The voice came from another officer, and for the first time, Reed's confidence wavered. The word hit him like a slap. Ma'am, he repeated, his voice quieter now. Maya didn't break eye contact. Tell the director I'll be handling this personally, she said, her tone calm, cold, and absolute. Reed froze. And in that moment, the air shifted. The ground beneath him didn't feel so solid anymore. Maya's words hung in the room, heavy and unshakable. But the look in her eyes said more than her words ever could. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. But he was about to find out. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and were pressing it back out, trapping it inside with Maya. She sat perfectly still at the scratched metal table, her posture straight and composed, but her fingers twitched slightly against the surface. Her mind, however, was sharp, turning over every detail, every word, every movement that had brought her to this moment. The cut on her lip throbbed faintly, but she ignored it, tasting the metallic tang of blood and letting it fuel her focus. She had faced pressure before, had stared down worse threats than Officer Reed, but there was something different about this place, something more suffocating. Outside the door, voices buzzed like static, too low to make out but impossible to ignore. She could hear footsteps coming and going, boots against tile, doors creaking open and slamming shut. She didn't have to see them to know they were talking about her. She could feel it. It wasn't just the sound, it was the weight of their curiosity, their judgment, their disbelief that someone like her, someone who didn't fit their mold, had dared to walk into their space and stand her ground. The click of the door handle snapped her attention back. The door swung open, and Reed stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. His boots hit the floor hard, each step deliberate, echoing against the walls. He didn't bother closing the door behind him, letting the noise from the hallway spill in. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed over his chest, his smirk sharp and cutting. So, he said, dragging the word out like it tasted good in his mouth, still think you're the one calling the shots here? Maya didn't move, didn't blink. She met his gaze, steady and unyielding. Reed pushed off the doorframe and stepped closer, his boots scraping against the tile. Because from where I'm standing, he said, you look a little out of place. Maya let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before speaking. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension. Reed's smirk deepened. Is that so? He stepped closer, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. And what exactly am I supposed to be regretting? Teaching you a lesson about who's really in charge here. Maya's expression didn't change. Touch me again, she said, her words slow and deliberate, and I promise you, you won't just regret it, you'll lose everything. Reed's face darkened, his jaw tightening. You really don't get it, do you? He said, his voice dropping lower. You think walking in here with your fancy suit and your big attitude makes you important? Makes you untouchable? Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. Untouchable, she repeated. No. But smarter than you? Absolutely. Reed's smirk faltered just enough for her to notice. Before he could respond, the door creaked open again. A younger officer, barely out of his 20s, stepped inside, clutching a folder to his chest like a shield. His eyes darted nervously between Reed and Maya. Reed, the younger officer said, his voice tight with hesitation, Chief wants to see you. Reed didn't move. He didn't even look away from Maya. I'm busy, he said, his voice sharp. The younger officer shifted on his feet, his fingers tightening around the folder. He said now, the officer repeated, his voice quieter this time. Reed let out a slow breath, stepping back from the table but not before pointing a finger at Maya. Don't go anywhere, he said, his voice low and threatening. Then he turned and stalked out, his footsteps pounding against the tile. Maya didn't move until the door clicked shut behind him. Then, slowly, she exhaled. Her hands relaxed, but her focus didn't waver. She had known men like Reed her entire career, men who built their authority on fear and intimidation, men who believed their uniforms made them invincible. She had taken them down before, and she would do it again. The younger officer lingered in the doorway, his eyes darting toward her. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Maya studied him for a moment, weighing her options. He looked nervous, unsure of himself, but there was something else in his expression, something that told her he wasn't completely comfortable with what he had just witnessed. Close the door, she said. He hesitated, but then did as she asked. What's your name? Eric, he said quickly. Eric, Maya repeated, leaning forward slightly. Do you know who I am? Eric shifted, his fingers twitching around the folder. No, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good, Maya said. Let's keep it that way for now. But I need your help. Eric swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the door. Help with what? Maya's eyes locked onto his. Getting into the case files, she said. Specifically, Reed's records. Eric froze. I can't do that, he stammered. I'll lose my job. Maya didn't flinch. Listen to me, she said, her voice sharp but steady. What just happened in this room? That wasn't the first time he's done something like this, was it? Eric hesitated. No, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Then this is your chance to do something about it, Maya said. Eric's eyes darted toward the door again. What are you going to do? Maya leaned back, her expression hardening. Exactly what I came here to do. Eric didn't say another word. Instead, he nodded slowly, then slipped out the door, leaving Maya alone once again. The silence felt heavier now, but Maya welcomed it. She could feel the pressure building, the storm gathering strength. She didn't know exactly how far Reed would push this, but she did know one thing for certain. He had no idea what was coming. And as the door creaked open once more and Reed stepped back inside, his eyes darker, his shoulders squared, Maya didn't flinch. Hope you're ready, he said, his voice low and sharp. Because you're not leaving this building until I say so. Maya leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. We'll see about that, she said. The door slammed shut, and the tension in the room snapped tight. Maya could feel it in her bones, the moment before everything exploded. And she was ready. The door slammed shut behind Reed, the echo reverberating through the small, windowless room like the crack of a gavel. The air felt heavier than before, pressing down on Maya's chest as if the walls themselves were closing in. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't let her face betray even a flicker of emotion. Her eyes stayed locked on Reed as he stepped closer, his boots grinding against the tile with deliberate weight. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set so tight that the veins in his neck strained against his skin. This wasn't the same Reed who had smirked at her earlier. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by something darker, something desperate. But Maya knew better than to let her guard down. Men like Reed didn't break easily. They didn't fold at the first sign of pressure. They fought back, clawed and scratched and bared their teeth until they had nothing left. And Maya was ready for it. Reed's voice broke the silence, low and sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said, his words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a punch. "Walking in here, acting like you're untouchable. Like you own this place." Maya didn't respond. She kept her posture straight, her shoulders squared, her hands resting flat against the cold metal table. She wanted him to keep talking, wanted him to think he still had control of the conversation, because she knew the truth. The longer he talked, the closer he came to falling apart. Reed leaned forward, planting both hands on the table and lowering his voice to a growl. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can just walk in here and tear me down?" Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't think," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know." Reed's breath hitched, just for a second, but it was enough. Maya saw it, the flicker of doubt, the crack in his armor. "You're bluffing," he said, but there was a crack in his voice now, just enough for Maya to latch onto. "Try me," she said, leaning back slightly in her chair, her confidence filling the room. Before Reed could respond, the door burst open. The sudden sound made him flinch, and Maya's eyes flickered to the doorway just in time to see Eric standing there, his face pale, his fingers gripping a tablet so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Sir," Eric said, his voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the tension, "you need to see this." Reed's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. "Not now." "Now," Eric insisted, stepping forward and shoving the tablet into Reed's hands. "Trust me. You need to see this." Reed hesitated, but something in Eric's voice, something sharp and urgent, made him glance down at the screen. Maya didn't move, didn't blink, didn't say a word. She just watched, her heartbeat steady as Reed's eyes scanned the screen. It didn't take long. The color drained from Reed's face so quickly that it looked like someone had flipped a switch. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the information, his breaths coming faster and faster. "What is this?" Reed finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya stood slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled. "That," she said, nodding toward the screen, "is your career. Or what's left of it." Reed's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "No, yes," Maya said, stepping closer. "You thought you could cover your tracks. Thought no one would ever find out. You were wrong." Reed shook his head, his breaths quick and shallow. "You're lying." Maya didn't stop. She took another step closer, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Payroll discrepancies, falsified reports, excessive force complaints, all buried under your name. And that's just the start. Should I keep going?" Reed's hands clenched around the tablet, his knuckles white as bone. "You set me up," he said, his voice breaking. Maya leaned in, her voice dropping low. "No," she said. "You set yourself up. You thought no one would look. Thought you were safe. But I looked." Reed's chest rose and fell quickly, his breathing sharp and uneven. "This isn't happening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is," Maya said, stepping back just enough to let him feel the weight of her words. "And now you're going to answer for it." Reed's eyes darted toward the door, but Eric stepped in front of it, his hands trembling but his feet planted firmly. "You're not leaving," Eric said, his voice shaking but determined. Reed turned back to Maya, his face red now, his jaw tight. "You think this makes you better than me?" Maya's eyes narrowed. "No," she said. "It makes me smarter than you. Stronger than you. And it makes me the one in control." Reed's fists clenched, his knuckles turning even whiter, but he didn't move. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and desperate. "You don't know what you're walking into." Maya's gaze sharpened. "I know exactly what I'm walking into," she said. "I know who you are, Reed. And I know what you've done. And now, so does everyone else." Reed's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words crashing down on him. "It's over," Maya said. "And the only question left is how you're going to handle it." Reed's eyes flickered with something Maya couldn't quite place, panic, maybe, or regret, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. "You think this is the end?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't over." Maya held his gaze. "Oh, it's over," she said. "And you know it." Reed opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the door. Heavy. Purposeful. The door swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes locking onto Reed. "Officer Daniel Reed," one of them said, his voice loud and clear. "You're under arrest." Maya's words cut through the tension. "You should have listened." As the officers cuffed him and led him away, Reed's anger burned in his eyes, but Maya didn't look away. The storm was over. Or so she thought. The metallic click of the handcuffs around Reed's wrists echoed in the small room, louder than it should have been, louder than Maya expected. It carried weight, a finality that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The two uniformed officers on either side of Reed gripped his arms tightly, their expressions rigid and unreadable, but Maya noticed the tension in their shoulders, the stiffness in their movements. They weren't just escorting a suspect, they were escorting one of their own. And that meant something. Reed stood rigid, his muscles straining against the cuffs as if he thought he might be able to snap them apart through sheer force of will. His breathing was sharp, fast, and uneven, and although his face was set in a mask of anger, Maya could see the cracks forming. It wasn't just anger, there was fear underneath it. Fear that he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. Maya didn't move. She stayed rooted in place, her eyes fixed on Reed as he shifted under the weight of the handcuffs and the judgment in the room. Her pulse was steady, her breath even, but her mind was sharp, cutting through every detail, every word, every movement. She had waited for this moment, not just tonight but for years. And now that it was here, she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. Reed's voice broke the silence first, low and sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his words coming fast, almost frantic. "You think putting me in cuffs fixes any of this?" Maya didn't respond right away. She let his words hang in the air, heavy and bitter, before stepping closer, her heels clicking against the tile with deliberate precision. "This isn't about fixing anything," she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on his. "This is about accountability." Reed leaned forward, his shoulders tightening against the officer's grip, his voice dropping lower but no less sharp. "Accountability," he hissed. "You think I'm the only one? You think I'm the problem? You have no idea what you've stepped into." Maya didn't flinch. "You're right," she said. "I don't know everything. Not yet. But I'm going to find out. And you're going to help me." Reed's laugh was sharp and humorless, echoing off the walls like broken glass. "Help you," he spat. "You think I'm going to help you tear this place apart? You think I'm going to roll over and hand you everything?" Maya stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was just above a whisper, sharp and deliberate. "You don't have a choice." Reed's eyes flickered, a flash of doubt crossing his face before he hardened again. "You think I'm scared of you," he said, but there was something hollow in his words now, something that told Maya he was already starting to break. "You should be," she said. Reed's jaw clenched, his fists tightening even as the cuffs bit into his skin. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice quieter now but still edged with desperation. "You don't know how far this goes. You think this ends with me? You think I'm the only one who's dirty? You're wrong." Maya didn't back down. "And I'll handle them too," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his panic. Reed shook his head, his breath quickening. "You think this badge protects you? It doesn't. Not from them. Not from what's coming." Maya's eyes stayed locked on his, unflinching. "The only thing coming," she said, "is the end of the line for you." Reed's breathing hitched again, and for the first time, Maya saw it, the moment the fight drained out of him, the moment the weight of everything crashed down. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the last flicker of defiance. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and rough. "You think putting me in cuffs ends this? You have no idea what you've started." Maya stepped even closer, close enough that Reed had to tilt his head to keep her in his line of sight. "I know exactly what I started," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to make him flinch. The officers shifted behind Reed, their grips tightening as they prepared to move him, but Reed wasn't done yet. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice shaking but still sharp. Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "No," she said. "You will." Reed's eyes burned as the officers pulled him toward the door, his footsteps dragging against the tile. He turned one last time, his mouth opening to speak, but Maya didn't give him the chance. "Take him," she said, her voice cutting through whatever words he had been about to say. The officers nodded and led Reed out, his voice echoing faintly down the hall until it disappeared completely. Maya stayed in place, her pulse steady, her breathing even, but her mind raced. She knew Reed wasn't bluffing. She knew the threats he'd made weren't empty. But she also knew that fear wasn't an option, not now. Eric slipped back into the room, his face pale, his hands trembling around the tablet he still held like it might shatter at any second. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya didn't take her eyes off the doorway where Reed had disappeared. "For now," she said. Eric swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the tablet. "What happens next?" Maya finally turned to him, her eyes sharp and steady. "Now we finish what we started," she said. Eric hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" Maya stepped closer, her voice calm but carrying the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. "I'm not stopping now," she said. "Not until this is done." Eric swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll start pulling everything we have," he said. "But what if there's more?" "There's always more," Maya said. "And we're going to find it." Eric hesitated again, but then nodded quickly and left the room. Maya stayed behind, her eyes lingering on the empty space Reed had occupied just moments before. She could still feel the tension hanging in the air, the echoes of his words bouncing around the room. But she didn't let it shake her. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Maya stood in the dimly lit hallway, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall as the sounds of Reed's footsteps faded down the corridor. The tension in her shoulders lingered, even as the weight of his presence left the room. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing through the next steps. The arrest was just the beginning, and she knew it. Reed's words still echoed in her ears, sharp and loaded with warnings she couldn't afford to ignore. He wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly, and whatever connections he had wouldn't let this end without a fight. But Maya wasn't backing down. Eric's footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway, hurried and uneven, the faint hum of voices trailing behind him. He stopped just short of her, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the folder against his chest. She didn't need to ask if he'd found more, his expression said everything. "We've got a problem," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya pushed off the wall, her eyes locking onto his. "What kind of problem?" Eric swallowed hard, glancing down at the folder as if the papers inside might burn through his fingertips. "Reed wasn't lying," he said, his voice tight. "There's more, way more. I pulled every record tied to his cases, every report he's ever signed off on, and it's worse than we thought. False evidence, tampered witness statements, illegal searches, it's all there, buried under layers of red tape. And it's not just him. There are names. A lot of names." Maya's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "How many?" Eric hesitated, his fingers curling tighter around the folder. "Too many," he said. "This isn't just a bad cop or even a bad group of cops. This is systemic. Organized. They've been covering for each other for years, planting evidence, hiding reports, silencing complaints. And it goes up the chain." Maya's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "How high?" Eric hesitated again, then handed her the folder. "Chief." The word hit like a punch to the gut, but Maya didn't flinch. She flipped through the papers quickly, her eyes scanning the names, the dates, the signatures. It was all there, spelled out in black and white. Patterns that had been hidden just well enough to avoid detection, until now. Eric's voice broke the silence. "What do we do?" Maya closed the folder and looked up at him, her expression hard. "We keep going," she said. Eric blinked, his jaw tightening. "Against the chief? Against all of them?" "Yes," Maya said. Eric stepped back, shaking his head. "They're going to come after us," he said. "You heard what Reed said. They're not going to let this go." Maya's voice didn't waver. "Let them come." Eric stared at her, his eyes wide. "You're serious?" Maya stepped closer, her voice dropping but carrying enough weight to cut through his panic. "This isn't just about Reed anymore," she said. "This is bigger than him, bigger than us. And if we don't stop it now, no one will." Eric swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice quieter now. "But how? We can't take down the chief without evidence, without more than this." Maya's eyes sharpened. "Then we get more." Eric hesitated, his fingers still trembling around the folder. "And what if they stop us before we can?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. "They won't." Eric let out a shaky breath, nodding again. "Okay," he said. "What do you need me to do?" Maya looked down at the folder one more time before closing it and handing it back to him. "Start digging," she said. "Pull everything, emails, financial records, surveillance footage. I don't care how deep you have to go, just find it." Eric nodded, his movements quicker now, more determined. "I'll get started," he said, turning toward the door. Maya watched him leave, her pulse steady but her thoughts racing. She knew this was bigger than Reed, she had known it the moment she stepped into the precinct. But seeing the proof laid out in front of her, staring at the names and signatures of people who had sworn to uphold the law, made it real in a way that even she hadn't been prepared for. She exhaled slowly, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Reed was just the first step, the first domino to fall. But the rest wouldn't be so easy. The people above him had power, real power, and they wouldn't let it go without a fight. But Maya wasn't backing down. She stepped out of the room and into the hallway, her heels clicking against the tile as she walked. Officers turned to watch her pass, their eyes sharp with curiosity and suspicion. She could feel it in the air, the tension, the uncertainty, the fear. They didn't know yet. Not all of them. But they would. And when they did, there would be no turning back. She reached her desk and opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up files, scanning through records and cross-referencing reports. Names blurred together, dates and signatures forming patterns that only became clearer the longer she looked. But one name stood out, over and over again. Chief Daniels. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. She picked it up, her voice sharp. Brooks. Eric's voice came through the line, shaky but urgent. You need to get down here, he said. Maya stood immediately, her heart pounding. Where? The evidence room, Eric said. You're not going to believe this. Maya didn't waste time asking questions. She grabbed her badge and headed down the hallway, her footsteps quick and deliberate. Whatever Eric had found, she knew it wasn't good. And as she reached the door to the evidence room and saw the look on Eric's face, she knew everything was about to change. Maya pushed through the heavy door to the evidence room, her pulse quickening as the dim overhead lights flickered. The space smelled of dust and old files, the kind of place where secrets were buried beneath layers of paper and locked cabinets. Eric stood near the back, his face pale, his hands gripping a stack of folders that looked like they'd been pulled in a rush. He didn't look up when she entered. His eyes stayed fixed on the papers in his hands, as though letting them go might make the truth inside disappear. Maya stepped closer, her heels barely making a sound against the concrete floor, but Eric flinched anyway, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. What is it? She said, keeping her voice steady even though her stomach was already knotting. Eric finally looked up, his eyes wide and uncertain, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed her the folders. You need to see this, he said, his voice tight. Maya took the folders, her fingers brushing against the rough edges as she opened the first one. Her eyes scanned the pages quickly, her breath catching as the pieces began to fall into place. These weren't just random reports, these were internal memos, financial logs, and surveillance records, all tied together in ways that left no room for doubt. She flipped through the documents, her jaw tightening as the connections became clearer. Payments disguised as bonuses, invoices for equipment that was never delivered, and a trail of transfers leading straight to Chief Daniels' office. She felt Eric watching her, waiting for a reaction, but she forced herself to stay calm, even as the weight of what she was holding settled on her shoulders. This is bigger than we thought, Maya said finally, her voice low but firm. Eric nodded, his hands still shaking. It's worse than we thought, he said. Look at the dates. Maya flipped back through the papers, her eyes narrowing as the timeline came into focus. This didn't just start recently, it had been going on for years, maybe even decades, and Reed had only been a small part of it. He wasn't lying when he said it didn't end with him. Eric stepped closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone. We can't do this alone, he said. This goes too high. If we go after Daniels, the whole department could come down on us. Maya looked up from the papers, her eyes sharp. That's exactly why we have to do it, she said. Eric hesitated, but Maya didn't give him time to backpedal. If we stop now, all of this, everything we've done, was for nothing. You know that, right? Eric's shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. And what happens if Daniels already knows we're onto him, he said. What if Reed's already told him? Maya shut the folder and set it down on the table, her voice steady. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to stop us. Eric swallowed hard, but he nodded again. Maya turned back to the papers, her mind racing as she pieced together the next steps. They needed more than evidence, they needed leverage, something that would force Daniels' hand before he had the chance to bury them. She picked up one of the folders and scanned the names, her eyes catching on a signature she recognized. It was an officer she'd passed earlier in the hallway, one of the ones who had avoided looking at her. She pointed at the name, turning the folder toward Eric. What do we know about him? She asked. Eric leaned in, squinting at the page. Officer Marcus Tate, he said. Been here almost 15 years. Quiet, keeps his head down, but his name's all over these reports. Maya nodded slowly. Then he knows something, she said. And if he knows something, we can use it. Eric's eyes widened. You want to bring him in, he said. Maya's voice didn't waver. I want to talk to him, she said. But not here. If Daniels gets wind of this before we're ready, it's over. Eric hesitated, then nodded. I'll find him, he said, grabbing his phone and stepping toward the door. Maya stayed behind, flipping through the files again, her mind moving faster now. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted wasn't just corruption, it was a system built to protect itself, to silence anyone who stepped out of line. Reed had been the first crack, but Daniels was the foundation. And foundations didn't crumble without a fight. Eric returned less than 10 minutes later, his face pale again. He's here, he said, but he doesn't look happy. Maya nodded, closing the folder and tucking it under her arm. Bring him to the back office, she said. And make sure no one sees you. The back office was small and dimly lit, a storage room repurposed with mismatched chairs and a dented desk. Marcus Tate sat stiffly in one of the chairs, his eyes darting to the door as Maya entered. She could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his hands fidgeted with the brim of his cap. He was nervous. Good. Officer Tate, Maya said, lowering herself into the chair across from him. He didn't meet her eyes. I'm not supposed to be here, he said quickly. I don't know anything. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. That's not true, she said. And we both know it. Tate's hands tightened around his cap, but he didn't say anything. We found the records, Maya said, her voice calm but deliberate. We know about the money, the fake reports, the evidence that disappeared. And your name is all over it. Tate's breathing quickened. I didn't have a choice, he said. Maya raised an eyebrow. Didn't you? Tate finally looked up, and there was something broken in his eyes. They gave me a choice, he said. But it wasn't real. You think you can say no to Daniels? You think you can just walk away? Maya didn't flinch. I think you can now, she said. Tate shook his head. It's not that simple, he said. They'll destroy me. My family. Maya leaned in closer. And if you don't talk, they'll destroy more families, more people who never even saw it coming. You have a chance to stop it, right now. Tate swallowed hard, his hands trembling. What do you want me to do, he said. Maya didn't blink. Everything, she said. And you're going to start with Daniels. The silence that followed was heavy, but Maya didn't let it last. She leaned back, her voice steady. If you help us, I'll make sure you walk out of this with your head up. But if you don't, you're going down with them. Tate's breathing quickened, but then he nodded, slowly at first, then again. Maya stood, the tension in the room breaking as she turned toward the door. Let's get to work. Maya stood outside the small office where Marcus Tate sat, his shoulders hunched and his hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. The dim light cast long shadows across the narrow hallway, but she could feel the weight of what was happening, the shift in the air as the pieces began to fall into place. She glanced at Eric, who leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his face pale but focused. He looked at her, waiting for a signal, but she didn't give him one. Instead, she opened the door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her as Tate flinched at the sound. Maya sat down across from him, her eyes locked onto his as he avoided her gaze, his fingers twisting nervously around the edge of the table. She could see the fear in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched inward as though he were trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, less vulnerable. But there was something else there too, guilt, heavy and suffocating, hanging over him like a storm cloud that had been building for years. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and spoke softly but firmly. You need to tell me everything, she said, her voice steady. I need dates, names, locations, everything you know. Tate shook his head quickly, his eyes darting to the door and then back to her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "They'll come after me. They'll come after my family. You think Daniels is just going to let this happen? He's too powerful. He's been doing this too long. He controls everything." Maya didn't blink. "Not anymore," she said. Tate's breathing quickened, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "You don't get it," he said. "You think Reed was bad? Reed was just a puppet. Daniels, he's the one pulling the strings. You think putting him behind bars is going to stop this? It won't. There's more than you can see." Maya leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. "Then show me," she said. "Show me what I can't see." Tate hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the folder on the table before he finally spoke. "It started years ago," he said. "Daniels wasn't always like this. At first, he just wanted control, over the department, over the cases, over the people who worked for him. But then things changed. Money started showing up, extra paychecks, bonuses that didn't make sense. At first, we thought it was just overtime, or maybe bookkeeping errors, but it wasn't. It was payoffs. And once it started, it didn't stop." Maya's eyes stayed locked on him, her pulse steady as the truth began to unravel. "Keep going," she said. Tate swallowed hard, his voice shaking. "People got comfortable," he said. "They stopped asking questions. They started looking the other way when evidence disappeared, when reports didn't match what happened. And the ones who didn't go along, they didn't last. Some quit. Some got transferred. A few just disappeared." Maya's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "What do you mean disappeared?" she asked. Tate shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Nobody asked questions," he said. "People just stopped showing up to work. No one talked about it. No one wanted to be next." Maya leaned back slightly, her mind racing. "And you went along with it," she said. Tate flinched but didn't deny it. "What choice did I have?" he said, his voice breaking. "I have kids. I have a wife. You think I wanted to be part of this? You think I wanted to sign off on false reports and let criminals walk free? I didn't. But it's not that simple. Daniels doesn't just let people walk away." Maya's voice sharpened. "And what about the people you hurt? What about the lives you destroyed by staying silent?" Tate's face crumpled, and for the first time, Maya saw tears in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know what I did. I hate myself for it every single day. But what do you want me to do now? It's too late to fix this." Maya's voice softened, but only slightly. "It's not too late," she said. "You can still make this right. But you have to help me." Tate shook his head, but Maya didn't back down. "You want to protect your family? Then help me stop him. Daniels doesn't get to win. Not this time. But I can't do it without you." Tate's breathing slowed, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then he nodded. Maya stood quickly, her mind already moving to the next step. Eric slipped back into the room, his eyes wide as he looked between them. "Did he talk?" Eric asked. Maya didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Tate. "Tell him what you told me," she said. "And don't leave anything out." Tate wiped his hands against his pants and started talking again, this time faster, like the words were rushing out before he could stop them. He talked about the bribes, the threats, the cover-ups, and the people who had made it all possible. Eric's eyes grew wider with every word, but he didn't interrupt. He just kept writing, his pen moving so quickly across the paper that it scratched against the surface. When Tate finally stopped, the room was silent again. Eric looked up, his face pale. "This is enough," he said. This is more than enough. Maya nodded, but her focus stayed on Tate. You're coming with us, she said. You're not going back out there until this is over. Tate's eyes widened. What? No, I can't. If they see me with you, they'll know. Maya stepped closer, her voice sharp. They already know. You said it yourself, Reed's not the only one. They're watching. But if you run now, you'll never be safe. Tate swallowed hard but didn't argue. Eric stood, gathering the papers and tucking them under his arm. I'll start putting this together, he said. We need to move fast. Maya nodded, her mind already working through the next steps as Eric left the room. She turned back to Tate. This isn't going to be easy, she said. But it's the right thing. And when this is over, you'll know you did the right thing. Tate didn't answer, but Maya saw the shift in his posture, the first sign that he believed her. She stepped toward the door, her hand on the handle. It wasn't over yet. Not even close. Maya sat at the long conference table, the polished wood gleaming under the soft overhead lights. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. Her hands rested on the thick file in front of her, the file that had started it all. Across the table, Eric leaned back in his chair, his face pale but steady, his fingers tapping anxiously against the edge of his notebook. Tate sat beside him, his shoulders squared but tense, his eyes flickering toward the door every few seconds like he expected someone to burst through it. It had been 48 hours since Reed's arrest, 48 hours of digging through files, connecting names, and pulling evidence out of shadows where it had been hidden for years. 48 hours of watching their every step, knowing that one wrong move could bring the entire investigation crashing down. But now it was over. Or at least, the worst of it was. Maya pushed the file across the table toward Eric, her voice calm but firm. This goes straight to the district attorney, she said. No delays. No stops. Eric nodded, his fingers tightening around the edges of the folder as though letting it go might make it vanish. I'll take it myself, he said. Tate shifted in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. And what about me, he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Maya turned to him, her gaze sharp. You're going to testify, she said. Everything you told us, everything you saw, it's all going on record. Tate's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I won't run, he said. Not this time. Maya leaned back, studying him for a moment. She could see the weight of guilt still hanging over him, but there was something else now too, resolve, the kind of resolve that came from knowing the truth couldn't be buried anymore. You made the right choice, she said, her voice softer. And when this is over, you'll have the chance to prove that. The door creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Maya. Chief Daniels is in custody, he said. He didn't resist. Maya nodded, but she didn't let herself relax. She couldn't, not yet. And Reed, she asked. Transferred to federal holding this morning, the officer said. Maya exhaled slowly, letting the information settle, but the tension in her chest didn't disappear. After the officer left, Eric leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Do you think it's really over? He asked. Maya looked at him, her expression hard. Not yet, she said. But it will be. Hours later, Maya stood outside the courthouse steps, her blazer crisp and her posture unshaken despite the cameras flashing in front of her. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping and sharp, but she didn't stop walking until she reached the podium. The crowd fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. Today is not about revenge, she said, her voice carrying over the steps. It's about accountability. It's about justice. And it's about the people who stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd before continuing. No one is above the law. Not me. Not you. And not the people who wear these badges. Today, we made that clear. The applause came quickly, followed by more questions, but Maya stepped away from the podium, letting the DA take her place. Eric caught up with her at the bottom of the steps, his face finally showing the first signs of relief. They actually listened, he said. Maya nodded. They didn't have a choice. Later that night, Maya sat in her office, the lights dimmed and the desk covered in loose papers and empty coffee cups. She leaned back in her chair, letting the exhaustion sink in, but before she could close her eyes, there was a knock at the door. Eric stepped inside, a hesitant smile on his face. "We got it," he said. "The warrants, the indictments, everything's in motion." Maya exhaled, nodding as she stood. "Good work," she said. Eric hesitated. "And Tate?" "He's under protection," Maya said. "For now." Eric shifted, his voice quieter. "And you?" he asked. Maya looked at him, her eyes steady. "I'm still here," she said. "And I'm not going anywhere." As Eric left, Maya turned back to her desk, her gaze landing on the worn leather badge holder sitting beside her computer. She picked it up, running her fingers over the edges before snapping it shut. This wasn't just a win. It was a beginning. Sometimes the hardest part of seeking justice isn't finding the truth, it's facing it. It's standing in the middle of chaos and knowing that doing the right thing won't always make you safe. But it will make you stronger. Maya didn't set out to change the system. She set out to hold it accountable. And in doing so, she became the kind of leader that didn't just demand respect, she earned it. This story isn't just about corruption. It's about courage. It's about speaking up when staying silent feels easier. It's about trusting that the truth, no matter how buried, will always find a way to the surface. And it's about knowing that justice isn't always clean, it's messy, complicated, and hard-fought. But in the end, it's worth it. What would you have done if you were Maya? Would you have taken the risk, knowing the system might push back? Or would you have walked away, letting someone else fight the battle? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know how this story made you feel and what you would have done differently. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you questioning what you thought you knew. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.